This is Duke University.
Last week on Left of Black, we featured part one of an interview with Professor Habiba Ibrahim talking about her new book, Troubling the Family, and the issue of the rise of multiracialism in American society. Today we feature part two of that interview. And we're also joined by Professor Yaba Blay, visiting assistant professor at Drexel University, who talks about her new project on the one-drop rule, examining what blackness looks like for a myriad of folks in the 21st century. My name is Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real IG for this one. Yeah.
With regard to the Oprah Winfrey moment, in addition to what Tiger does with regard to rebranding himself, as he put it, there's the way that Oprah herself is, I think, fairly key in that moment. So we understood, as we've just, sort of gone over, the way that, when he wins, the press is really interested in yoking his accomplishment to that of Jackie Robinson, because it's the 50-year anniversary.
Right.
Exactly. Jackie Robinson's also breaking the color barrier in a way that Tiger Woods seems to do much later. And so that connection was often remarked upon in news journalistic accounts of his win. So we had that narrative already in place. And then Tiger Woods, as we just mentioned, sort of goes over the black male golfers who came before him but paved the way for him. And so we have, to some degree, that sort of masculinist that makes us understand Tiger as black, right? That there's something about this lineage of masculine exceptional.
Exceptional black men, right.
That is masculinized, and that allows us to understand Tiger as the heir to that version of exceptional, masculine black achievement that to some degree allows us to understand who we are, right? So there's this, but because blackness had been so closely tied to masculinity in that moment, I think what Oprah's presence and the space that Oprah produces that allows Tiger Woods to disclose his Caucasianness is not so much to have him cut himself off from this lineage of blackness, but I think it also does something with regard to gender. That, for one, we kind of understand Oprah as being the conduit, the black female who is sort of, to some degree, she's very, she's the conduit in much the way that black women are with regard to the potential of masculinizing.
Right, emasculating, or as some folks might term it, yeah.
And I think that to some degree, while it's very implicit, I think that's occurring. And the reason I think it's also occurring is that he gets cut off from this lineage that's carefully in place with regard to blackness at the site that he enters this highly feminized space that Oprah mistakenly creates for daytime television for a predominantly female audience. But he also then becomes on the radar of proponents of multiracial activism. We have, for instance, in that year, the Tiger Woods bill that comes up, which was that bill that attempted to have a single multiracial category in right? So to call it the Tiger Woods bill would be a way for signaling to predominantly white proponents of multiracial recognition. Those really invested in having some sort of multiracial category on the census were now able to sort of co-opt, if you will, Tiger Woods as a kind of, if you will, poster child.
Yeah, they could claim them, right? They could claim them.
Right. And so I think that because the proponents of multiracial politics during the 1990s were predominantly female, there's been work with regard to who the players were. Kim Williams, for instance, and Mark Winter Moore thoroughly goes over, who the main actors were with regard to producing what could be called a multiracial movement. And as does Kimberly DaCosta in Making Multiracials. There are a number of accounts of who, in fact, were the actors, who were the ones who were leading multiracial organizations and sort of setting an agenda.
Right.
And were white women of the middle class who were interested in having some way of accounting for their multiracial children publicly on state forms, et cetera. And so it's for this reason that I'm sort of thinking of two things. We started this conversation with the observation that there's a kind of tension between blackness and
multiracialism. Yeah,
that sort of, becomes really salient during. It's almost as if they can't really be discrete, and yet it's very hard to recognize their kinship, if you will. In addition to that, it seems like there's this conversation between a sort of Black masculine lineage. There's something about masculinity as it determines how we understand racialization. And, sort of this this question of feminizing gender, feminizing race, if you will, that happens explicitly, although I don't believe that multiracial proponents understood this as its precondition.
Right.
That multiracial cultural politics was contingent on an analysis of gender, and more specifically, were sort of dependent on the contributions of second wave feminist analytics.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Habiba Ibrahim, who's the author of the new book, Troubling the Family, The Promise of Personhood and the Rise of Multiculturalism, University of Minnesota Press. Now, I want to pick back up on that gender piece, Habiba, because of all the scholarship that's been done around these mixed race themes and multiracialism, one of your contributions really is to focus in on how gender frames much of this conversation. And in particular, in the chapter where you talk about legitimizing the deviant family and thinking about the Loving case, and then thinking about the Moynihan report, which, the Loving case, gets placed down in the context of all the discourse around the Moynihan report that really contributes to what becomes a crisis of the Black mother. The immediate thing you think about in terms of popular culture is that image of Halle Berry and losing Isaiah and the inability of the Black mother to serve the mother. And again, in a historical moment in the late 1990s, 1997, where many white women, not just women who are looking to Asia for adoption, but also white women who are looking in terms of African-American children for adoption, are looking for a rationalization, right, an explanation for their multiracial children, and there needs to be a scapegoat. and Isaiah's mom, right, becomes the scapegoat for this kind of moment.
Yes, and I think that the question of where Black maternity belongs in the larger scope of multiracial politics, particularly with regard to family formation, is key, which is why I yoked together what seem like two really disparate legalistic moments.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so we think of, Loving versus Virginia is the Supreme Court decision that strikes down miscegenation laws, right, as the law of the land. So prior to that, there were several states that still had anti-miscegenation, that still had anti-miscegenation laws, on the books, including Virginia. And so what Loving did was it, by striking down anti-miscegenation laws, it opened up the marriage market according to race and ethnicity. So this means that race or ethnicity could not be taken into account with regard to heterosexual marriage, right? I mean, it means that individuals are free to choose their partners irrespective of race or ethnicity, and the state is obligated to recognize that choice and that freedom. So we understand, and it's often been understood in work that really sort of traces the beginnings and the preconditions for a multiracial movement that emerges at the end of the 20th century, that the Loving decision is really that sort of originary moment for multiracial politics in the 1990s, because it legitimates not just interracial marriage, but by virtue of this, it also legitimates multiracial families because children are now legitimated. This wasn't the case in states that had anti-miscegenation laws like Virginia. What would happen is that not only are these laws illegitimate, but the children who come out of these, unions are, which means they don't have the right to inheritance, et cetera. Right. So what happens is that by the 1990s, there is a very consistent, tight concern about the well-being of multiracial families. And to some degree, this is why the question of how one can account for one's multiracial children on state forms, school forms, et cetera, becomes a sort of key agenda point. But what I'm interested in, and what I think might be a sort of useful way of historicizing the 1990s era multiracial movement, is not just to consider the Loving decision as an originary text that then, sort of leads us in sort of a straight temporal line to the 1990s. I'm interested in thinking about how the Loving decision is sort of concomitant with the Moynihan report. Yes. There are two things that make me think this. The Lovings were arrested in their home state of Virginia in 1958, which is before the Moynihan report is published in 1965, or is leaked and then, becomes more public in 1965. And so the Moynihan report was really about not so much, kind of giving the onus of choosing one's family, to a generalized public. It wasn't simply about opening up the possibilities of family formation and legitimizing them. It was about thinking about the Black family as that which is already deviant, right? And particularly deviant as a result of pathologically single, pathologically emasculating Black motherhood. So there are two things then. I'm interested not just in the way that the Moynihan report wants to sort of not just demonize Black families, right, which is what it did. I mean, we can recall some of the policy, sort of discourses in that piece. It's really about sort of thinking about why the Black family to some degree can't be more self-sufficient. Why can't the Black family, after the gains of the civil rights era up until 1965, why can't the Black family now, to some degree, become less dependent on the state for welfare and become more self-sufficient? Hence, why can't the Black family, privatize its own well-being? To some degree, this sort of conversation about privatization has overtly racial piece there, right? Obviously, it's targeting Blackness and the Black family explicitly. But in addition to this, it's also speaking about the family in general as that unit which should replace any sort of obligation the state has to the welfare of our citizens, et cetera. It sort of thinks about the family as that which should, for all intents and purposes, function in a way that relinquishes the state from having to take care of Black children. Right. And because that policy decision was about to some degree, normalizing family life. And not just normalizing it, I mean sort of neutralizing the tenets of what family life should be. It should be, to some degree, patriarchal, right? The problem that emerges in the Moynihan Report is that Black fathers are nowhere to be found, right? They have no place in the family because they have trouble finding work, because they can't support their children, etc., right? And they leave. The Loving decision was also, to some degree, about normalizing family life.
Right.
But what it doesn't seem to account for is how the sort of neutralization of the marriage market, which is to say that once all of us can partner in a heterosexual union, irrespective of race and gender, that we're kind of now dealing with a kind of neutrality that makes us think that the state is no longer interested in race. We also have, at the same time, concomitantly, this other document that is very much about the racialization of family, even as it's attempting to make family life seem neutral. Family life should be patriarchal. Family life should be functional according to the privatization of wealth, etc. So I think of the Loving decision and the Moynihan Report as interesting texts to consider in tandem because they allow us to think of the 1960s not only as that which legitimizes multiracialism by the 1990s, it also allows us to think about what both of those moments, both of those policy and legal moments, did to have us think about family life to some degree as the horizon of social action, that it becomes relegated to the private sphere.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Habiba Ibrahim, who's been talking about her new book, Troubling the Family, The Promise and Personhood of the Rise of Multiculturalism, University of Minnesota Press. Professor Ibrahim is Professor of English at the University of Washington in Seattle. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Habiba.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, coming to you here from our studios here in the John Hope Franklin Center at Duke University. And we're joined by Yaba Blay, who's a visiting professor of Africana Studies at Drexel University in Philadelphia. She is the curator of the multimedia project, the One Drop Project, author of the forthcoming One Drop, Shifting the Lens of Race. As well, she is a co-editor with Chantrell Lewis of Sex Crimes Against Black Girls, an anthology, and she's a consulting producer for CNN's Black in America 5, which will debut in December of 2012. How are you doing today, Yaba?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So tell us about this project. There's a lot of conversation going on, obviously, with President Obama in the White House about mixed race identity and multiracial identity. And, when we think about a term like one drop, it makes us think of a much older racial history. Talk a little bit about how you got into this project, which is really about us rethinking what blackness looks like in America, if not the world. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so with this project, I absolutely came to it, through personal experience. For the most part, up until this point, my research is focused on skin color politics, and I've tended to take the standard direction, meaning that, I investigate the social cultural disadvantage of having dark skin in a racialized society. And so, for example, my dissertation on the phenomenon of skin bleaching in Ghana. I've also done some work on women who self-identify as Creole in New Orleans, trying to understand what that identity means. And so with this project, really taking my work in a new direction, and it was really kind of inspired by a personal experience that I had as a panelist at the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York City. I was asked to come and talk a little bit about my research on skin bleaching as well as skin color pop, the diaspora. I had two co-hosts, and one of them was Clemente, and I remember as we were talking, Rosa as a Black Puerto Rican woman from the South Bronx, and so sitting there, surprised necessarily, but it was new information for me because, again, I'm from New Orleans. I grew up in New Orleans, and so if you know anything about the New Orleans context, there's a preeminent group of folks, historically preeminent at least, who self-identify as Creole, not white, not Black, but Creole, and so within the New Orleans is very real. Skin color politics is very real. And the privilege associated with light skin is also very real. And that comes to impact the ways that people identify. And so I didn't grow up around a large Latino community. And even as I started to study the African diaspora, yes, I know that Latinos, Puerto Ricans specifically, are of African descent, but I had never met anyone who actually self-identified as Black or as Afro. And so Rose first. And so I remember, being on that panel and then afterwards speaking with her at length about that experience, just wanting to learn more and wanting to talk to more people like Rosa who self-identify as Black, whether it's despite of or because of their appearances. And so that was really the starting point for me.
Okay. Talk a little about some of the folks that you've talked with. When we go to the One Drop website, there's all these beautiful pictures, a myriad of folks who show up. Talk about some of the conversations with these folks, how you even, were able to contact them. I mean, it's kind of interesting, kind of reaching out to folks is like, well, what kind of Black do you feel that you are, or something along those lines. But talk a little bit about kind of the logistics of pulling together a research project of this magnitude.
Right. What's interesting, the project has blossomed in ways that I could have never imagined. I mean, at first, I just wanted to do it for myself. I thought maybe I would get an article out of it. I ended up writing a small grant for the Leeway Foundation here in Philadelphia. And so then with that money, self-published a small coffee table book. But once it got started, it just kept rolling. And so I initially started with folks that I knew who kind of fit this category of people who, originally I think I was just saying light-skinned, people who might have been racially ambiguous, and just to have a conversation with them. And it's interesting because, and you'll see this in Who is Black in America, which airs December 9th, but one of the first people that I interviewed was actually a colleague of mine at Temple, Danielle, also a student at the time. And I didn't Danielle identified, but the fact that she was at Temple, of all places, in African American studies, I assumed that it was somehow connected to Blackness. But we weren't really cool, so to speak, when we were in school. And again, I'm at Temple out of the New Orleans context. And so in this moment, I can reflect back and say that even the ways in which I connect with people, I had created friends at the time, a lot of times had a lot to do with the presumptions that I made about people, women specifically, with light skin. So we weren't cool, we weren't friends, but we were cordial. And so we became cool after I graduated. I reached out to her to doing this project, and I remember her asking me specifically, well, how are you going to portray light-skinned people, right? So this question of if this is a woman, a dark-skinned woman who does work on colorism, why are you now interested in this?
Are you going to be working out some retribution?
Right. And so just the kind of conversations, some of the questions that I asked folks were, question is, how do you identify racially and culturally? And so when you look at the website, the nomenclature that is in quotation marks under their quote is their answer to that question. And so the nomenclature also becomes a very interesting dynamic because people use all types of language to self-identify. There's folks who choose Black over African American. You've got folks who want to say Black and Latina. You've got one of the brothers in the project says, I'm a Black man with a white mother. And so you see all of these creative ways that people are identifying to tell us. So really, each interview functioned as a conversation of sorts. I asked them about how they identified. I asked them about what people assume about their identity when they first encounter them and how that makes them feel and how they navigate that situation. And quite simply, what is Blackness to you, or how are you Black? And so most of the people in the project I am connected to through one in some way, shape, or form. I need to know that I was doing this project and asked if they could refer folks. And then some folks just came to me and said, I've got something to say. So in the international folks as well, a lot of people I connected with through Facebook and Twitter. And so really hope an endpoint to it at some point. Right now we've got 56 contributors, and I'm sure it could go on, but as next steps, I'm really interested in looking at this definitely beyond the American context functions in so many other places in the diaspora.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host, and we're joined by Yaba Blay, who's a visiting assistant professor at Drexel University in the Department of Africana Studies. She's a consulting producer for CNN's Black in America 5, which will debut in December of 2012. And she's the author of the forthcoming One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. You have, on the website, there's a wonderful quote from the late Stephen Biko, where he states, "Being black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being black is a reflection of a mental attitude." Talk about that a little bit.
It's interesting because honestly, prior to embarking on this project and having this with all these different people, blackness wasn't something that I ever had to think about, right? That blackness just was, you know, look at me. It's the a priori fact of my blackness. I'm not walking in a room and no one's asking me anything, right? And so talking to folks, and these are conversations that they've had to have over and over again, because so many people assume that blackness is an identity that is recognizable, right? That if you be able to see it, and if I can't see it, then you're not black. And so constantly having to define and having to choose who they are and why they identify as black. And so they're able to enter the conversation, let's say, from a different standpoint. And so this idea of blackness being more than a color. It's very interesting. I think one of the examples that really kind of brought it home for me, there's a woman in the project by the name, and if you look at the front grid, you know, she just looks like a light-skinned woman, perhaps. When you click on her image and you read her quote and you see the secondary image, what you learn is that she has vitiligo, and that through vitiligo, she has lost all of her pigment. And so it's interesting, we had this conversation, she talked about Michael Jackson, really made me rethink, because, you know, when I do presentations on skin bleaching, I often use Michael Jackson popular example, right? And so this idea that no, you know, there is a skin disorder that can cause us to lose all of our pigment. Am I somehow not black now? You know, when I walk through the streets and see people I grew up with now think I'm an older, not black anymore. And so it really gets us to this point of wanting to question, okay, once you remove skin color, once you remove pigmentation, is there blackness? And if so, what is it? You know, and so many of our contributors are able to think about the ways that I think, you know, I haven't, or at least not articulated up until this point, and that is blackness as a political identity, that there is function, you know, to identifying as black that transcends skin color.
And that raises an interesting question, right? Because, you know, particularly with the rise of hip hop over the last 30 years, there's so many of these examples, particularly of young white men, you know, who kind of perform hip hop identities. And one of the always pushbacks that they would get is that, well, yes, you can listen to the music, you can wear the clothes, you can even ape the style, if you will, even authentically to some extent, but you never have to live your body in the body of a black man and deal with what that particular reality is. Some of the folks, the informants that you talk to, you know, how do they respond to folks who are critical of them as not really having to live in the body of a black person, given what that means in terms of racial violence and profiling and a range of other things that comes with being black in society?
Right. It's interesting. Many of them are very much aware of that. You know, they acknowledge that, yes, I may not have the quote unquote typical black experience. I may not have your black experience, but I am having my black experience, and it is valid, you know? And so there's one woman, Kathleen, who actually talks about, you know, for many years, and in fact, she appeared on Donahue some years ago. Donahue had this show called, I want to say it was called Blacks Passing for Whites. And she was on that show and coming out of that experience and writing an article for Ebony called Trapped in the Body of a White Woman, you know, and she talks about, you know, at one point in my life, if you had said I could take this pill and be as dark as you, I would. Right? But in this moment in my life, I have to make peace with what God gave me, right? And this is the body that I have, and this is how I identify. And if I have to continue to have conversations with people to talk about it, so be it. Because I think many of the informants are quite clear why people question their identity. You know, they understand how blackness has been projected in this world and in our society to be darker skin or browner skin. And so, yes, one of our informants even said to me, yeah, part of being black is having an experience of being black. So what's interesting is looking at their memoirs is that they're giving us a diversity of black experiences, right? So maybe blackness isn't as narrow as being stopped by the police or being followed in a store or being, you know, pointed to and saying, look at that black person. They have some unique experiences themselves.
Were there any surprises? Were there conversations that you had with informants that just, quite frankly, kept you with your mouth open and shocked and surprised?
I mean, there were quite a few instances of surprise. Some folks, from the men especially, there was one man who told me, quite frankly, and not something that I didn't know, but interesting that someone had actually come out and said it to him. But, he said, having grown up in West Africa, that you'd have African sisters who would approach him and say, we should just have children together because then my babies will have good hair, right? That kind of thing. Or having another gentleman who's very light-skinned say that, he can walk into a space and people assume that he's white and be privy to all these conversations that most of us won't ever hear, right?
The old Eddie Murphy skit, yeah.
Right. But then that moment where he announces, well, I'm one of them, how their reactions change and the conversations that come out of that. I was definitely surprised by one woman, Sembany, who has vitiligo also. And she talks about in her narrative how people clearly don't know what vitiligo is. And so folks will walk up to her and say, well, were you black first or were you white first? Right? And so, or some of the participants with albinism,
Right.
One woman told me that, she's standing at a bus stop minding her business and people jump out the car to take her picture.
Oh,
wow.
Wow.
And so one thing that is something that I'm still not, sure how I feel about, but something I haven't necessarily made peace with is everyone talking about this experience of strangers walking up to them and saying, what are you? Yeah. And having this kind of vibe that they expect them to answer and to explain themselves. And not that I don't have the question, but I've never felt so emboldened, to walk up to somebody, to ask and to demand a question. And so I've really learned a lot. Actually, it's really put me in a space to kind of check a lot of the assumptions that I've come to the table with about light-skinned people in general.
You've been watching Left to Black. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Yaba Blay, who's a visiting professor of Africana Studies at Drexel University. She is the curator of the multimedia project, the One Drop Project, and the author of the forthcoming book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. She's also a co-editor with Chantrell Lewis of the forthcoming Sex Crimes Against Black Girls, the anthology. And you can see her next month on the 5th installment of CNN's Black in America, of which she is a consulting producer. Thanks for joining us, Yaba.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything. All black, all black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos, all black medallions, yeah. All black, say, all black everything. All black, all black in the name of all my black heroes.